do have a handout here for you. So I'm Dorothy Kozlowski. I'm in the Department of Biology. I've been at DePaul since 2000, and my focus in the Department of Biology is I teach neuroscience courses and statistics. And so one of the things that I've been studying for a long time is how the brain recovers from brain injuries. And part of how it does that is through a relearning process. So I've always been interested in plasticity and learning, and the more I thought about it, as I was actually writing up my tenure packet, I thought, well, a lot of what I've been doing in terms of changing my teaching is because I've got to better understand the neuroscience of learning, and the field has gotten better at understanding the field of neuroscience and learning. And so a couple of years ago, Sandy and I and some faculty from English and theater put together a workshop for one of the teaching commons. It was the day-long thing that they all do. And it was on the neuroscience of learning, and looked like it was popular, so we've been asked to come back and talk to you all a little bit more about this today. So learning itself relies on a neurological concept called neuroplasticity. And you may have heard it around, used colloquially a lot, but really what neuroplasticity is the brain's innate ability to change. And it changes in response to either an injury, which hopefully none of us are injuring our students when we teach them, although, you know, some of us might want to. So we're not really going to talk about plasticity as it is a compensation for injury, but a change in one's environment. And that's what we're doing when we teach, right? We're changing our students' environment. We're trying to get them to think differently, to learn something new. And so that is actually changing the way our students' brains are structured and how our students' brains work. So in order to understand neuroplasticity, I'm going to have to go into the sciences a little bit here. So my job is to tell you a little bit about the nitty-gritty of the cellular basis of learning, which we know pretty much about. And then Sandy's going to move over and talk more about the cognitive aspects of neuroscience. So in order for us to understand the neuroplasticity and the cellular processes that underlie learning, we have to know about the main cell of the nervous system. It's something called the neuron. Neurons take different shapes and sizes. These are two of my favorites. But this whole thing is a cell, okay? So this neuron has a cell body, which is this one little slot right here, okay? And that cell body is, if you remember back to high school biology, it's basically where your genes are held, where your proteins are made, etc. And that is something that all cells have, even neurons. Neurons are unique, though, in that they have all these other processes that stick out of the cell body. Okay? They have these dendritic trees, or branches, okay? Rightfully named because they look like a tree. These dendritic trees, their role is to bring in information. Okay? And then once they bring in information, it processes itself through the cell body, and then it leaves the cell through something called the axon. And the axon is really akin to an electrical wire. Okay? That is how information leaves the neuron through this axon, through this electrical wire, and it really is an electrical synapse. What it's doing is it's sending its message as a change in voltage. Okay? So think of it this way. You've got one neuron, okay, this neuron, it's trying to talk to this neuron. Okay? So this neuron is sending a message out through its axon, through an electrical current, and it's coming over to this neuron, and this neuron is receiving the message through its dendrites. So the dendrites are the catcher, the axon's the pitcher, and the ball is the message. And so if you look at this and you see, wow, this cell really has a lot of dendrites. What that means is that this cell is very primed to receive a lot of information. Okay. And so what happens in learning, a lot of times, one of the things is that you have a structural change. So these dendrites grow and change in shape. The actual physical structure changes. Okay. That's one way you can measure neuroplasticity. Another is by the strength of the message that's relayed between the two cells. And the message relayed between the two cells happens at a place called the synapse. synapse is really a generic term that means a place where two neurons communicate. Yes?
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I'm not trying to be like a talking head at you. Yeah, please.
When it comes to the interconnections, does learning stimulate the generation of interconnections, or do the interconnections just take place whether you're asleep or not? Like when students are sleeping in class.
There is this thing called the unconscious. So yes, so there is interconnections happening right now. Even when you're asleep, okay, you've got the nervous system taking care of everything in your body, right? Your breathing, your heart rate, your digestion, everything that goes on that you don't even realize or take for granted. But when you're learning, things are going a little bit faster. Okay, like right now, some of you might be sprouting a dendrite or two, or a synapse or two. Okay, I hope so. Okay, or if not, you can sleep. That's fine too. Okay. So I may be able to answer your question better as we go through this first part. If I don't answer it completely, come back and rephrase it for me. So we have this thing called a synapse, and that's where two cells are going to be talking to each other. Sometimes it's a direct connection between the two neurons. That's called an electrical synapse, where the charge literally just flows from one wire to the other, just like if you just connect two wires together. That's not really the type of synapse that's involved in learning and memory overall. The kind of synapse that we're going to talk about is a chemical synapse. So you've got an electrical signal. Does this have a flare signal? No, that's okay. I'll use mine. You have an electrical signal coming down the presynaptic neuron. The neuron, this is the picture, okay? And when it does so, it comes down and it causes a release of neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter is a chemical, many different types out there, that relays a message by connecting to these receptors here, okay, on the postsynaptic neuron. So you've got electrical signal releasing chemicals. The chemicals then bind to this postsynaptic side. This is a dendrite here. And then that causes a whole slew of intracellular cascades, which we're not even going to talk about today. But what these intracellular cascades do is they cause this second neuron to send a message. Or sometimes these intracellular cascades cause the second neuron to create new proteins so that it can actually grow in some way, or make another part of their dendrite called a spine. So the basis of synaptic plasticity is really understanding, well, what is it about the signaling of that first neuron that's going to change how this second neuron signals? And sometimes that's how many neurotransmitters are released. Sometimes it's how many receptors are available to get the message, to make the message stronger. Sometimes it's how much growth has happened in the second neuron. So plasticity can be measured in a lot of different ways. I'm going to focus more on kind of structural, growing new things, because that's something I think we can all relate to. We all want to grow our brains, right? Okay. So where are these neurons that we're talking about that are relevant to learning and memory? The main part of the brain that is responsible for the kind of learning and memory that we're going to talk about today is something called the hippocampus. Okay. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, I'm borrowing this from Sandy and still learning how to use it here. So the hippocampus, to the left is the hippocampus of a rat. To the right is the equivalent hippocampus of a human. Okay. The kind of learning that the hippocampus is responsible for is the learning of people, places, and things, factual knowledge. And for the most part, many of us, that's what we're trying to impart on our students, some sort of factual knowledge of people, places, or things. Okay? I know in theater, movement gets involved, music, different types of movement gets involved too, but I'm going to focus more on sort of just factual people, places, and things kind of knowledge. Okay? And so that all is happening here in the hippocampus, the learning aspect of it. So the way it works is that the hippocampus has these different sets of pathways that you see here. Pathway comes in to the hippocampus from all brain regions. Okay? So you see something, you hear something, okay? You think of something, you move. That information then gets filtered into the hippocampus. And what the hippocampus has to decide is this something I need to learn or not? And so what the hippocampus decides, and I know I'm being anthropomorphic here. Okay. If the hippocampus brain areas really don't think on their own. But if the hippocampus decides that, yeah, this is something important enough to learn, then what's going to happen is that these signals are going to get strengthened, and the information is going to leave the hippocampus and go off and store itself somewhere in the brain as a memory. And depending on the kind of memory it is, it might go back here. If it's something visual, it may go here. If it's something auditory, language related, it may go here. If it's, ooh, I shouldn't do that again. Okay. So there's different parts of the brain that store memories. So the hippocampus doesn't store memory. The hippocampus creates the learning. It creates the memory that then gets off and goes stored somewhere else. Why are we so confident that the hippocampus does this? Sandy's going to give us a very nice video of a gentleman who doesn't have one anymore. Okay. And we've had a number of case studies as well as experimental studies with rats doing a variety of things to the hippocampus to see how rats can or can't learn. And you can augment learning by enhancing the hippocampus, or you can eliminate learning by removing the hippocampus. Your question? Yes?
Why is it called the hippocampus?
The hippocampus is a word, is Greek, Latin, I don't remember which one, for seahorse. Greek, thank you. For seahorse. And believe it or not, the hippocampus does look like a seahorse. If you slice the brain and you look at a real brain, not a drawing, and you look at it in a particular way, it really does look like a seahorse. Thank you. Yeah. Greek, I have to remember that because I always forget it. It's Greek for that. Yes, there's a question back
It's
there.
all with the MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging, where you can figure out which parts of the brain, because they're looking at things for the electrical signals. That's what shows up in MRIs. Is that correct?
MRI is not looking at electrical signaling. MRI is looking purely at structure.
Because my understanding is when they figure out which part of the brain is interacting, it's done by looking at the electrical signals.
So there is something called functional MRI, fMRI, and
Yes.
functional MRI, that's where a subject is given a radioactive marker of some sort, either for oxygen or for glucose, small amounts, just like an X-ray, okay? And that gets incorporated, and that is imaged, and that activity image is then superimposed onto the structural image. So then you can say, oh yeah, this little bump over here in the brain is active when you're doing something.
I've seen pictures where it looks like the brain is, that was a highway of, all these little streets, and what lights up are the paths that are communicating.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
And it's not perfect, but that's the best way that we have right now to be able to try and get some understanding of how the human brain functions electrically. Okay, so we now know that the hippocampus has this ability to create learning. How does it decide that it's time to create learning? Well, it does so using this concept called long-term potentiation, or LTP. What LTP is well, first let's talk about this setup here. So here you have one of the pathways in the hippocampus. You've got these neurons talking to this neuron. Okay? You can stick electrodes in these, and you can measure the amount of electrical activity that these two neurons are producing and that this neuron is producing. And then you can use these electrodes to stimulate in any fashion if you like these two neurons, and see how this neuron responds. And in doing these kinds of experiments, what people have found is that if you just stimulate one of these neurons, okay, let's just say this guy here, and then you measure the electrical activity of this neuron, it's sort of typical, okay? It's sort of what you would expect when one neuron talks to the other. However, if you stimulate two neurons together within the same pathway that both talk to this neuron, and you do so in sort of a pattern, and you do it with a frequency. So it'd be sort of like me saying, I'm stimulating the picture of the neuron in LTP and the word LTP. Okay, so you're seeing the picture of LTP, you're hearing the word LTP. And these two are coming into your brain at the same time and stimulating this neuron at the same time. This neuron knows, oh wait, two things are telling me this is something similar. I better pay attention. And so if you do that over and over and over again with a specific type of frequency, then what you get is this. Here is just the change in electrical activity before you do any sort of stimulation. Okay. After you stimulate the brain in this paired, frequent manner, That is the firing rate of that second neuron. So the firing rate of that second neuron increases significantly. Okay? That's due to the fact that the first neuron, they end up sending off more neurotransmitter. There's all these other changes that go on cellularly, etc. So that's great, but who cares, right? Does it stay? Well, if you wait over time and you just stimulate one pathway, so you stimulate both of these and you get this neuron to fire more actively. You wait a little while, up to 30 to 40 minutes if you're just doing this in a little petri dish. And you just stimulate one of them, this guy fires as if both have been stimulated. So this neuron now is listening. It's primed for LTP in that picture. And when it hears at least one of them, it's going to say, hey, remember this? This is important. We better put this in our memory somewhere. And so these are sort of the signaling changes that occur with LTP. What happens is if you do this enough, you actually start to see structural changes in the neuron. So these are very high magnification photos of a dendrite. And dendrites have these little buttons on top of them. It's called a it's called a spine. Okay? And the spine is where the synapse happens. Okay? So before LTP, you've got this spine here. That's about that size. The blue means it's not as active. Yellow and red means it's more active. After hitting this dendrite with LTP a few times, that spine increases in size and is now more active. Yes?
I must have missed something on one of the previous slides. It said before and after tetanus. What was it?
Oh, tetanus is the frequency and the pattern of stimulation. It's just the scientific term for that.
Thank you.
So not only can you make existing spines bigger and more active, you can also grow brand new spines. Okay, so here's a fluorescent image of an actual neuron, not a drawing. Okay, up there is just one of these dendrites before it undergoes long-term potentiation. See, it's nice and straight. And then after you look at it after long-term potentiation, it sprouted two new spines. So what it says is that, hey, I'm getting a lot of this information. I better be ready to get more of it. So I better make some new places for synapses to occur. This is just at a one-cell level. Imagine, though, this, our brain doesn't work just one cell to the other. We've got thousands of cells talking to thousands of cells all the time. So if these things are growing and changing, it's actually causing physical changes in our brains. They actually did a study of, I'm going to throw this one out, I didn't say this to the last group, but they did a study of London cab drivers, and they measured their hippocampi. Some of them who were just only driving around for 30 days or so, and then some who were driving around for 13 years. The hippocampi of the guys they were mainly male, mainly of the cab drivers who had been driving around London for years, had bigger hippocampi than the ones who didn't. Hippocampus is also very good at spatial learning and how to navigate yourself. So it's not just happening in rats or in a cell culture dish, it's happening in humans too. So now that you know the kind of cellular nitty-gritty of what goes on in LTP, what I want to do is now relate this to, well, how in God's name does this have anything to do with our teaching? Okay. It does, because there are some, you can't just stimulate neurons willy-nilly and think that they're going to undergo LTP. There are some rules and some characteristics that the stimuli have to have in order for LTP to occur. And the first is this idea of associativity. Associativity, basically all that really means is that if you just stimulate one pathway, you're not going to strengthen any other in that neuron. But if you stimulate two pathways, you're going to stimulate both of these pathways and the neuron that they're synapsing onto. So if you associate information, the picture of LTP, with me saying the word LTP over and over and over again verbally to you, okay? These associations are what's going to allow your brain to learn something, as opposed to me just talking to you about LTP up here without any visuals. That would have been bad, right? Probably. Okay. So that's associativity. You could probably already begin to think about how you would use this in your teaching. Yes?
Is it just repetition in terms of I see the word and I say the word, or I say the word and I see an image related to the word. Is it just that kind of repetition, or is it because it may be redundant? And then sometimes we even tell our students, don't read what you have on your presentation.
Right.
That's wrong.
Right. So there is a point at which the hippocampus just says, okay, I've heard this 10 times, right? I don't need it anymore. Okay. And that's a concept, although it doesn't really happen in the hippocampus per se, called habituation. You don't know you have clothes on, right? Your skin's not screaming, your neurons aren't screaming that you have clothes on right now, or they have glasses on your face, right? I've wandered around looking for my glasses and they're on my face, right? Because you habituate, you ignore it. But if it's novel enough, or if it's presented slightly differently each time, but the general gist is the same, that's also associativity. So it doesn't have to be as, I'm trying to simplify if you can appreciate that. So yeah, and association also doesn't just mean, let me show you the material, let me hear the material. So associating it with something that they understand. So one example that I'll show you is that I have to teach students this pathway about how information goes from your fingertip. Okay, if I pinch my fingertip, how that message travels all the way up to this part of your brain that listens to that fingertip pinch. Okay, it's boring. It just is. Okay, it's, you gotta go over here, you go to this part, this part, this part, this part. Okay, what I try to do is I try to associate it with something they understand. Going from DePaul to O'Hare. Okay? You're getting on an on-ramp. At the on-ramp, sometimes you have to change lanes. Okay? Sometimes you get on the express lanes to get there faster. Okay? So associating it with something more real world to them.
This example, I think, is calling out something that I've read it from a number of sources. When we think about the amygdala and hippocampus, it also is sometimes referred to as the primitive brain. And what I've seen in various versions of research on the brain and learning, that when there's also an emotional component, retention increases. And I wonder how that figures in, because on one level it seems to be that the primitive brain can move into a fight or flight process and shut down and limit learning.
Yes.
But on another level, when there's an appropriate sort of the sweet spot of an emotional response or awareness or meaning making, then retention increases. I don't know if you can expand on that at all, or
that kind of goes back to this idea of associativity, but it also goes into the last one. We can jump around, I don't care. Of personal importance. So there's many studies out there show that emotion can enhance learning. Absolutely. So if you're trying to get a point across, adding some emotion, and that can be in a lot of different ways. It doesn't mean screaming and getting angry. It can be humor, it can be whatever, but having them not see your emotion, but instilling an emotional response to the material that they're seeing, and that may be easier in some contexts than others. If you're doing something historical, you can, instead of just talking about something, showing a video of the people at that time, and the students can relate and feel what it was like during that time. That's one example. Okay. But emotion and stress are two different things, and I think what you're alluding to of how emotion can shut down your learning, it's more stress that shuts down your learning. And so, that is absolutely true. And you don't want to pair any of your learning with stress because then it won't happen very well.
So would you say, if you thought of fear as an emotion, but maybe you're saying fear would be more a stress, that if somebody moved into a point where they felt over-challenged or it triggered a really negative experience that they'd had, they would start to create an association. You're probably familiar with the fire together, wire together term, that they start associating, new learning and new technology with fear.
Yes,
Is there,
yes.
I mean, I don't
So-
mean to get stuck here, but I'm...
It's true. I mean, fear is a subcomponent of stress, absolutely. But fear on its own isn't always stressful.
Right.
It can't be, obviously, but there is,
Like discomfort or...
Right, exactly. So there is a fine line, and it's more of a psychological fine line between fear and stress and emotion and stress. But definitely emotion is something that you can link to. So I'll jump to personal importance. So the idea that, because we're talking about that. We know that this is true of our students, right? It's all about me, deal with it. Some of us think that way about ourselves too. Right? Personal importance is you want to make your materials something that the students can relate to, some experience that they can latch onto. And that's even with the examples that you use in class. One example that's a bad one that I'll share with you about personal importance is outdated. So I always try to teach my students that you can chunk information into 7 components, like learning a phone number. What's that? We don't learn phone numbers. We have contacts. And I'm good at that now too. Don't ask me what my brother's cell phone number is. I don't know. It's click. There he is. So making sure you're up to what might be personally important to students. I'm not saying cater to everything, but try to think about some of your learning. Is there something that's going on in their lives or in their world right now that you might link to the information that you're doing? An extreme way, an example of personal importance, I actually, in one of my topics classes, it's a seminar-based course for seniors, they create the syllabus on what they want to know. I have 9 topics in neuroscience. What do you guys want to talk about? It's all about them. It's good for me because I go off and learn new things about neuroscience I didn't know about it. Neuroscience is a huge field. But that's an extreme example of giving them, showing them that there's personal importance in the material that they're studying.
You mentioned chunking into 7 things. The term 7 comes up very frequently. They talk about the brain. I know in marketing, they talk about laddering up and down in your brain, 7 layers. And it appears that the brain is hardwired to be able to manage at most 7 things. Is there any neuroscientific evidence that 7 is the number?
Sandy's going to talk a little bit about that, so I'm going to let her answer that in her presentation.
But the quick answer is yes. Plus or minus 2.
Yes. And one thing you mentioned, stress is not good. In Flow, the guy from the University of Chicago, Mahoney, whatever, he talks about when you're in flow, there's a balance between interest and stress or something. I don't know.
Anxiety and boredom.
Is that what it is? Anxiety and boredom. Okay.
So I'm not saying all stress is bad. We all work. Some of us work better under a little bit of stress. I know I do. If I have a deadline, I'm a little bit better than I'll get to it. It's a personality thing. You all know from your own students, some thrive on having a deadline and being challenged, whereas others cower in a corner because it's new and they're freaked out by it. So that's a real hard one to address in the course, just because there is such variability. But are you going to talk about the visualization before? Okay. So Sandy's going to tell you about one way in which you can help control stress in the classroom. This is what's bad about me going first, is I hear what Sandy has said, and then I'm like, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to include that because she's okay. So let's move on here. So the other concept about long-term potentiation that makes it work better than others is this concept of multimodality. Okay, and this idea that if you can bring in, and I'm just going to use sensory modes here, although this can also include movement, which we talked about in the last session. If you can include more sensory experiences in your learning, and I'm not talking about, the idea that there's a visual learner and an auditory learner. I think there's pros and cons to that type of thinking, because I don't know if the data is not really strong enough to say that there really is all of these different types of learners out there. But what I'm saying is that going back to if I show you something and you hear it from me, 2 different parts of your brain are going into the hippocampus now with the same information, okay? Coming in from 2 different modalities. In class, I don't typically write out my PowerPoint slides. As you can see here, the majority of them are all visuals, right? I'm not really giving you step-by-step outline of my talk. I do that for a reason, and different people, Sandy has a different approach to this. My reason is that it forces them to also write. And there's data out there that shows that when you write something, as you're hearing it, as you're listening to it, that's also causing a strengthening of connections. So I'm forcing them to write. I also write on the board, which forces them to decipher my writing. And after a while, they learn that squiggle is an R, okay? And that squiggle is an S. Okay? So I try to add as many sensory modalities in. When I taught an animals and science course, we went to an animal facility. They got to see, they got to smell, they got to hear. That really was the highlight of their learning, and they remembered most of what we talked about that day, not just the facility, but everything we talked about that day, and they forgot reports of everything else. So multimodality. I'm going to give you one more, and then I want to make sure you all have an opportunity to think and share. Yes?
I just want, is there a risk in too many modalities in terms of overloading?
I haven't seen any data that suggests that. Sandy, have you?
I know with the marketing research, there's too many options can be limiting for students, right? So as opposed to like you're narrowing down for them a syllabus in your class, these topics. So it's not just any kind of topic for class. There should be a small number, just like at Starbucks, right? When you go in and you're overwhelmed by all the cappuccino, whatever you can get, you have to have a smaller number of options. But I don't know about modalities.
Yeah.
I wonder if that relates to cognitive load research that, when there's literally a capacity issue.
Mm-hmm.
But
I've never tried to use all 5 at once, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
It's hard taste in class, you can maybe smell a thing or two, but.
When I read in some of the learning and development literature, it advises to probably do 2 modalities and not try to do 3 or 4.
Sensory modalities.
Sensory modalities.
Mm-hmm. But then also think of, you're actually also getting them to move.
Right.
You're getting them to write. You're getting them. There were a great example at the last session of a gentleman who taught math, and he actually made the students get up, and he had them. There was graph paper on the floor, and he gave them 6, 5. That means you're at 6 on the x-axis, right, and 5 on the y. And he made them physically go and stand in that place. So actually, the physical act of moving and being part of learning sometimes can be helpful. Jane Brody in theater really gets into this. She was one of our panelists the last time we did some of this. So then the last concept that is required, or the last stimulus characteristics that is required for LTP is frequency. Although this isn't the best example I was told last time, but I didn't have time to change one because this doesn't work, right? You say that 10 times and it still doesn't work. So information presented only once to someone is lost by 50% within 20 minutes. Repetition, this is all this is. And I'm not saying just saying the same thing over and over and over again. What I mean is, in my class, I always start each lecture with a summary of the last lecture. I always, when I bring up new concepts, I make sure they see how it relates to an old concept, and then there's frequency, there's repetition of the old concept again. Okay? I tell them not to cram, because I tell them, okay, whatever you're cramming right now, make sure you find that question on the test and write it down within the next 20 minutes or so, because it doesn't stick. So frequency, however you want to do it, and it doesn't have to be the same modality the same way, but repeating multiple concepts in multiple different ways, or the same concept in multiple different ways, linking it to other concepts, associativity, doing it in a variety of modalities, okay, that's going to help information stick a little bit better. So I want to have an opportunity for you to think about this, and you can pair up. It's a bigger group, so I don't know if you want to pair up and talk a little bit about this, or if any of you want to share. So picking one of the characteristics that's needed for LTP and thinking about how you already are doing this in your teaching, or thinking about a different characteristic and one that you maybe aren't incorporating as much, and thinking about how you might want to incorporate that. So I don't know what would work better. This is a big group, perhaps taking about 5 minutes or so to think about this, jot a few notes down, feel free to share with your neighbors or friends, and then we'll share with each other some ideas, and you won't just get my ideas, okay? You'll get others, and I'll get yours. That'd be great. Sort of touch back with you and see what kind of ideas you came up with, what you'd like to share with the group. Let's start with the first one, just a couple of examples of how you're already doing this in your classrooms. And when you speak, just kind of let us know what who you are and where you're teaching, what you're teaching, etc. Anybody want to volunteer?
Paul and I'll volunteer Paul.
Okay,
yeah,
volunteer
thank
Paul.
you. Actually, I do it more as a pastor than any other way, but
Okay.
well, a Bible class, we use taste, not so much as part of the class, but we have coffee and every Bible class,
There you go.
which does bring people in.
And
Yes,
we were
it does.
talking about the different learning modes, and something that I seem to recall is that your sense of smell will bring back the most intense memories, the quickest. And my understanding was, from a neuroscience standpoint, I guess, is that there are fewer connections between your nose and the brain than some of the other senses. And the example you used for animal health teaching, you talked about going in and seeing animals and smelling the animals. I thought that's great. I mean, it's because it's really tight in your nose. And we were just sort of convincing about, well, maybe that's way we could bring the sense of smell into. For example, I teach one college, they teach mathematics. And maybe there's some way I can incorporate the sense of smell.
If you do, I'd love to hear it, because that would be really, really pretty.
That's easy to do.
But you guys are bringing in emotion,
You get the
right?
answer right,
You know,
you get the
the
nice
camaraderie and the
sentiment.
coffee
You
and
get
the
it wrong,
donuts. and-
really bad wrong, not nice or something.
All right, another example of that one? Yes.
Well, I'm coming from fiction writing, and coaches that want, the writer in a single paragraph even to be evoking all five emotions, all five senses to involve the reader. So the reader's making personal connections. So the reader's remembering certain, to the end of the novel, you're making all these sort of connections and also just say a popular genre like mystery, where the reader feels really right because they're making all these connections that somehow the author is introducing in, not hitting them over the head.
Right.
but in all these other
Letting us
ways.
make our own deductions of
Right.
who did it.
Right, and that's the pleasure.
Okay. Great. One more?
I teach both adult learning theory and some organizational change courses, and one of the things I found is often beginning with something experiential gives everyone a shared experience, but also gives them something to tap into for personalization. So, and it might also be, the experiential might be, think about a time when, so they evoke a memory, and then we start relating once we get into the theory or the research. They're personalizing it by a lived experience, either one we've just shared in class or one that they're relating it to. And then we were talking about taking reflection time throughout, just as we are doing right now. It might be pair share, it might be individual journaling, but to give people a chance to create story or to create context.
The associations, get the personal
Throughout as they're learning, instead of a big chunk of a lecture and not having a chance to throughout.
Great.
I know lots of people want to share, but I want to respect Sandy's time. What about the second one? Did anyone get some new ideas that they might want to try? That's the tough one. Yeah, I know.
I volunteer to have.
Okay.
There's something very
You came up with an
interesting.
idea?
Well, we were sharing that I use a lot of storytelling to get the students comfortable. I teach what can be contentious topics in intercultural communication. Okay. And I find that when I start sharing some of the stumbling blocks I've had and some of the things that I experienced in my childhood related to my own family, they start to think more about, I recognize that in my grandmother, or I recognize that in my neighborhood, or I recognize that. And by the third week, they feel safer, and then they start to dialogue, and then they learn from each other from their fields. So that was our discussion.
Thank you. And one more. Yes.
I think going back to that time concept of giving the opportunity to reflect, but not just after the lesson or the next week, but kind of mix that up so that maybe we'll talk about week 2's topic again in week 7 and just see what new connections can be made. I mean, I think we do that, or I at least do it somewhat haphazardly when it comes up. Maybe a student brings it up, but to be more intentional about revisiting concepts and letting some time go by for things to gel. It's hard to do in 10 weeks. That's always been my challenge.
And it's hard to do when you're trying to get all your content in, right? And we're always concerned about content. But yeah, so that the realization that it's okay to kind of go back and be more proactive about it as opposed to, oh yeah, that makes me remember what we did back then. Great. Well, thank you all. Thanks for your attention on this Friday afternoon.
I just want to thank you again for coming out, like Dorothy mentioned, on this cold day. It's so nice of you guys to be interested in neuroscience. My name is Sandy Virtue. I'm from the psychology department, and I actually use cognitive neuroscience methodologies in my research lab. So I look at reading comprehension. I use fMRI, I use divided visual field studies. We just received a grant in psychology to receive EEG equipment, so we're excited about that. And I look to see what areas of the brain are involved when people successfully understand a text, and then what areas of the brain are involved when people have difficulty comprehending a text. And I want to know, what do those brain areas reflect in terms of cognitive processing? So it's not actually the areas that I'm interested in, but what it tells us about how we read. So that's where I'm going to be coming from today. So you'll notice I'll use lots of examples with regard to language and reading. So I'm excited today to apply some of this neuroscience research to our teaching. I think it can really be informative in telling us maybe what strategies we're already doing to justify why we're using those strategies, and then, like Dorothy mentioned previously, thinking of some new strategies based on neuroscience research. So to start off today, I'd like to give you a real-life example of how the hippocampus, which Dorothy did a great job of telling us all about, is important with regard to memory and learning. We can learn a lot about the hippocampus through individuals who have deficits in the hippocampus. So has anybody heard of Clive at all? Okay, one person. Excellent. So this is fun. I like to share Clive because he's one of those examples you won't forget once you see this video of him. He contracted viral encephalitis from herpes in his brain, and it specifically damaged his hippocampus. And what's unique about Clive is that he has a unique type of memory deficit called anterograde amnesia. So he's unable to form new long-term memories. So we're going to see a short video of him, and he's talking to people, and you'll see his wife come in the room, and he's so excited. He recognizes his wife because he has that information in his long-term memory, but he doesn't remember that she came into the room 10 minutes ago. He's a musical conductor, so you'll notice he actually sings as she enters the room. All of his conducting skills are actually still intact, although he's not able to form new long-term memories. So he often talks about how he's trapped in the eternal present, and his last day of conscious thought was March 26, 1985. They often refer to him as the man who keeps falling in love with his wife. You'll see in the video, he uses a journal to document and try to help him because he knows he has these memory deficits. And you'll see he writes a lot about his wife, Deborah, in the journal. He also writes a lot of things. Today, I am conscious for the very first time. And you'll see that he has a lot of difficulty remembering what's happening, what just happened, but there's something unique about his love for his wife that you'll see in the video that still remains. And for some reason, it just happens to work out. I usually show this video in my class right around Valentine's Day, so it kind of touches everybody. So I try not to get teary-eyed because it's a very emotional video, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it. So let's listen to Clive.
Also worked a great deal in contemporary music and was chorus master of the London Sinfonietta, which is Europe's foremost group.
Music flows out of him, whether he's singing or playing or conducting.
Clive Waring, through a cruel twist of fortune, shows us how fundamental consciousness and memory are to our lives.
You please to see me?
Oh, but nobody else I care about. Well, let's hope.
So how are you feeling?
I'm conscious of this time.
First time I've seen anybody.
Not been conscious before?
No.
I've been here before this
I haven't seen you.
No, you haven't?
No. I've not seen anything at all before. Been completely blind after that. No taste, so this is the first taste.
That's the first coffee you've had?
Yes. Cheers.
Cheers. How are you seeing things?
Absolutely normally. First time.
Colour?
Yes. I've never seen anything the whole time I've been here. No black and white, nothing.
Do you remember me arriving?
No. I don't remember any arrival at all. I don't remember writing any of that. Nothing to do with me consciously. Unconscious writing.
What are you doing here?
I don't know, simply playing patience, but I mean, that's the first time I've seen any cards.
Is it?
Yes.
Do you remember starting the game? It all started with a headache. Clive came home one day and said he had a very bad headache. The headache didn't lift, it didn't respond to analgesics. By the fourth day, he developed quite a high fever. And on the evening of the fourth day, for a little while, he forgot his daughter's name. By the fifth day, he was very delirious.
Clive suffered from viral encephalitis, which has led to the damage of the left and the right temporal lobes, plus a good portion of the left frontal lobe. Now, the temporal lobes contain a structure called the hippocampus, which we know is implicated in memory function, and in Clive it has almost certainly been completely destroyed in both sides of his brain. It's this that's primarily responsible for his severe memory impairment. In addition, the damage to his frontal lobes also causes a number of additional memory problems, which are manifest mostly in terms of him repeating himself a lot and generally showing highly emotional behaviour.
Clive's world now consists of a moment with no past to anchor it and no future to look ahead to. It is a blinkered moment. He sees what is right in front of him, but as soon as that information hits the brain, it fades. Nothing makes an impression, nothing registers. Everything goes in perfectly well because he has all his faculties, his intellect is virtually intact, and he perceives his world as you or I do. But as soon as he's perceived it and looked away, it's gone for him. So, it's a moment-to-moment consciousness, as it were, a time vacuum. And everything before that moment is completely void. And he feels as if he's awakening afresh the whole time.
How has it been?
It's been such a good year.
Imagine 1 night, 2.5 years ago. It's definitely been there. Never seen anything until now. Not even anything before this game. But I give him the impression of being conscious.
He always thinks he's been awake for about 2 minutes. And that's why he looks at his watch all the time to record it. To record the fact, I've woken up, this is an important event, therefore I will write it down in my diary. So he writes, 11:54 a.m. I am now completely awake for the first time. And he underlines first time. Patience begins, because he's always playing patience. And the whole diary, every page, is a succession of entries saying almost the same thing, of first awakeness. And when he goes back and looks at his own entries, he doesn't acknowledge that they are genuine. He says, he knows it's his handwriting, but as far as he's concerned, he was unconscious when he wrote them. So he quite often, he'll score out what he's written before. And so his life is an ever-repeating moment of first awakening. The strongest thing in his life, I believe, and his diaries bear that out, is his love for me. And that's absolutely raw. And each time I walk into that room, it is as if it's the first time he's seen me for years.
Good heavens above!
Hello. You surprised to see me?
First time I've seen anybody at all. First person.
You've not seen?
Okay, so we'll go ahead and stop there. I can watch Clive. It's so interesting and such a sad case of how important our hippocampus is. I'm always interested when I talk about these case studies and talking about different topics of what happens to the individual. With Clive, he actually was in a psychiatric hospital for some time after this video was shot. For amnesic patients, there's really no place designated to help them. So this isn't an appropriate place for him, but that's where he spent many of his years. His wife, who you see in the video, Deborah, ended up divorcing him, but his son had to give his consent to get divorced. But she still visits a lot, and there's some sense that he knows that they're not together. And this point has caused a lot of heated debates in my classes. It was one of these things I thought I would just talk about the hippocampus, show this video, move on, and half the class say the wife shouldn't have divorced him. The other half said, oh yes, she should have. How could someone be married to an individual who doesn't remember? So we've had some heated debates. It's really interesting on this. And he still writes in his diary today. About his ex-wife. I can never forget you for a moment. You're the reason for my heartbeat, darling. I love you for eternity. So there's something unique about this bond he has with his wife, but he's unable to form these new memories. Yeah. Do you have a question? Oh, just stretching? Okay. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to jump in. So hopefully, oh yes.
Yeah, I'm struck by how you keep saying that this is the first conscious moment. Is there any argument that he's not conscious, that this is actually all unconscious behavior?
That's a good question because they've done some MRIs and fMRI studies with Clive, and it's, as far as I understand, it's just because he's unable to form these new long-term memories. So he doesn't remember waking up. He doesn't remember seeing his wife, Deborah. So it's this kind of interesting state where he feels like he's just woken up. There are other brain disorders with damage to the temporal lobe where people feel as if they're dead. I don't know if people have heard of Capgras syndrome. It's a rare disorder. And because of the way that the brain has been damaged, they have these strange sensations on their body, and then it leads to them to report it in that way. So I think it's just similar to Clive that he honestly just doesn't remember. But he is unconsciously processing things. So that brings up a good question. In further studies, they showed him lots of cartoons, and he loved watching them. He never remembered seeing them, right? So they show him the same one again and again. But what they did show is right before there was something funny that happened in the cartoon, Clive would laugh. Mm-hmm. So there is evidence implicitly, right, that maybe he's still learning this information. And it could be due to some neuroplasticity that Dorothy talked about probably. So good question, yes.
I also, there's something significant about the connection he has with his wife, and that it may bring back to the idea of emotion and memory and also relational knowledge. We often think of knowledge only as our people, places, and things, but there's a huge context for relational knowledge that is often intertwined with emotion.
I think that's a great point. I usually show this in my undergraduate class, but my graduate students this quarter weren't familiar with Clive, so I'm like, you have to see Clive. Mm-hmm. So I show the video, and a lot of them are clinical psychologists, so they had that response, which was really interesting because usually the undergraduates don't talk about this relational response. And so that's an excellent point. Is there another? Yes.
Because you mentioned you're tied into psychology here. In Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, part 5 is the two selves. Mm-hmm. It's the experiencing self and the remembering self. And this is a wonderful example of the experiencing self.
Absolutely.
And in some ways, he's a very fortunate person. He's always happy.
Yes. Yes. It's interesting you bring that up. And I don't know if I self-selected these videos for my class, but most of the case studies, which could be a tragic, and this could be tragic. I don't know if I'd be as happy as Clive if I was in his situation, but you have to give him credit, right? And a lot of the situations I show in my class of people who have unique brain disorders are just kind of, they realize things could be worse. There's an individual I show with prosopagnosia who has difficulty recognizing faces, and it's so severe that he can't even recognize his own face. And by me just describing it, it seems hard to understand. But if I show a video of him, his name is Larry, talking about how he's at a party, and he sees a guy, and the guy nods for him to proceed down the hall, and he says, no, you proceed. And he said, this goes on and on. He's like, well, I'm not going to wait in the hallway forever. So he walks into a mirror. And to hear him tell that story, it's just amazing. But again, he laughs about it, right? So back to your point, he's like, well, it could be worse. And that's, it should give us all a good look, It could be colder.
Not much.
Not much, but it could. We've been there, right? The first day of class. So really good point. So today
I want to talk about why we should even use neuroscience research to inform our teaching strategies. And then I'm going to talk about how I've tried to apply some neuroscience findings in my classroom. So I'm going to talk about 6 key findings and then some specific strategies I've tried to use, particularly in online teaching. You'll notice both of these, it can apply to both traditional face-to-face classes and online, but I've been recently developing some hybrid and online courses, so I thought it'd be fun to apply this research to that area. And then I'll wrap up with conclusions, and then I'd like to get your questions and your thoughts on this in a discussion. So to begin, I'd like to start off by reading 3 quotes about the importance of linking neuroscience to our teaching. One researcher says, students' learning is impacted by how the human brain accepts and processes information delivered in a course. A person says, teachers do not have to become neuroscientists, but teaching practices can become more effective with the knowledge of how the brain perceives, senses, processes, stores, and retrieves information. And the last quote, education initiatives that link current practice with promising new research in neurological and cognitive science offer real possibilities for improving our teaching and learning. So today, I might not be presenting any new strategies to you. You'll probably recognize all of these that you do in your classes, but I think it's nice to link the research to these specific strategies. I'm always trying new things in my class, and if I know that it's founded in some kind of theoretical framework or research and it doesn't work, then I don't feel so bad, and I tell the students this. But if not, then I just abandon it, right? But knowing that it's based on research, or try something a little different next time, and hopefully I'll have better results. So from my perspective, I think we can use neuroscience research to make better decisions about our teaching strategies. So it can help me understand why some of the strategies I use may be more effective and other strategies that are less effective. I also think we need to base it on theoretical frameworks and specific research findings. There's so much great research out there and lots of great teachers like you all. Why not use the research and the skills that we know and incorporate that into our classroom? And I think this is important not just for ourselves, but for our students. So I mentioned I try new techniques, new teaching strategies in my classroom, and I feel more confident if I know they're based on research. And I think the students appreciate that. One thing I do in my classes is I give the students a PDF file of my lecture notes with key things missing. And what they have to do is, as they're watching the online lecture or they're in class, they have to fill in that missing information. As you might imagine, students hate this. They say, why not give us all of the notes, right? Don't give me notes with things missing. But when I explain to them that research shows that if you're active while you're learning information, but not overwhelmed writing everything, that you learn the information better. So then they're okay. I mean, they roll their eyes and they comply and say, okay. And it does help them learn better, okay? They might not like it, but I think they can get on board with it. And then I think lastly, we can apply these kinds of strategies in both the traditional face-to-face class and in online settings. And so let's start talking about some research and how we might be able to apply it. From neuroscience research, we know that visualization activates the same areas in the brain as actually seeing real stimuli. And this occurs in the back of the brain or the occipital lobe. Then what happens is this information is transferred into long-term memory in the hippocampus, which we've talked a lot about today. So what do we do with these findings? In all my neuroscience classes, when we talk about brain activity, I always say, so what? Why do we care, right? What do we do with this? Well, I try to apply this research in my online classes by using lots of visual stimuli. So instead of just showing you on my head where the occipital lobe is, I can show you this image. And I think that will actually help you visualize this later when you're trying to remember information about the occipital lobe. I also try to use lots of videos, as you notice with my Clive wearing example, photos, images, graphic organizers, flowcharts, diagrams. I love online simulations. Dorothy did a great job talking about long-term potentiation, but when I discuss it, I'm not as good as Dorothy, so I show this simulation of what's happening at the synapse so that students can really visualize what's happening. When we talk about drug addiction, I show at the synapse what's happening when someone's taking cocaine, what happens during withdrawal, and I think that tends to help them learn this information. And then I try to give lots of examples of abstract concepts. We know those are more difficult to visualize, so hopefully that will help students learn the information as well. An example of this I talk about in my class a lot are split brain patients. So you might be familiar with that. These individuals have an abscess corpus callosum that connect the left and right hemispheres. And to understand what's happening physiologically, you have to know the neural pathways from the eyes to the brain. So instead of just verbally explaining this to students, I show them this image and say, okay, when stimuli or image or word is presented in the right visual field, it's initially processed by the left hemisphere. The same thing happens in the left visual field when a word or image is processed. It initially goes to the right hemisphere. And then in normal participants, this information transfers between the two hemispheres. However, in split brain patients, because they don't have this corpus callosum, the information stays isolated one hemisphere or another. And then we talk about interesting results with those studies. Okay. Another topic we've already briefly discussed is using emotion to help students' learning. From neuroscience research, we know that emotional stimuli leads to the release of specific neurotransmitters that can increase our students' learning, such as serotonin and dopamine. In addition, I think somebody already mentioned, we know that the amygdala helps regulate our emotions and might lead us to remember information more easily. I want to mention, too, one comment I had based on your good questions earlier. People are talking about anxiety, emotion. There's a lot of interesting cognitive neuroscience research done on arousal. And what they show is this inverted U function. So they show that if you have low levels of arousal or very high levels of arousal, it's actually detrimental to learning. So you need that medium level that, you're not so laissez-faire that you're falling asleep, but you're not so stressed that you can't even focus. That's ideal. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm from the Office of Health Promotion and Wellness, and
great.
That's exactly the workshop that I've been doing a lot.
Oh, terrific.
So I teach the neurobiology of stress, and we talk about hyperarousal and hypoarousal, and then I take them through body learn, and how to actually track their arousal levels so that we talk about it in the sense of, isn't this the way you want to take a test, And then when you walk into class, and then just tracking, it's also mood regulation and a lot of other things.
I need to go to that. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's really, really great. So it's definitely something that I'm happy to do. And I've also worked with faculty and staff on the same thing in more of the context of like burnout and self-care and our own arousal levels as we're in the classroom or wherever we are, on campus, or if we have a student in front of us and we're working with a student that triggers our arousal levels. So just how to stay in touch that way.
It's terrific. I'll have to get your information. That sounds
The
great.
students love it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's Yerkes, and I think Dodson's Dodson, if my spelling is correct. It's similar. If not, I can send you. But it's, and then the other thing to be aware of, that is just a general function of arousal and performance. Then you also need to take into account how difficult the task is, right? So obviously, if you have a very difficult task, that inverted U shifts. So if I'm trying to learn, about art, I know nothing about art, I might be very anxious. I don't consider myself very creative. It makes me nervous. So I want to have a very easy task because I'm already anxious about that information. So if you have a very difficult task, you want less arousal than you normally would. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. If you have an easy task, you want to make the arousal higher. So if I ask students, I try to do this at the beginning of all my classes, I give them, and they know this, a 5-question quiz over the material, and it's supposed to be easy for them. So it's timed, but it's low stakes. But I don't want to exhibit a lot of anxiety or stress in them. I just want to assess their learning. So keep that in mind. The complexity of the task interacts with the arousal level as well. So how do I integrate this in my online classes? I try to stimulate critical thinking in my students. So instead of just asking them yes, no, factual questions, I ask them to work through certain problems. So more thought-provoking, online discussions, get their opinions about things. I also try to use humor or music. I haven't done too much, to be honest, with the music factor. I know that there are faculty who, depending on the topic, have different music as the students come into the room. I mentioned this last time. I think I'd really date myself. I like music from the 80s, and the students would be like, who is Daryl Hall and John Oates, right? They wouldn't understand that, so I haven't tried that yet. I haven't been brave enough. But you guys know, right? They're fun. It'd be fun to have that coming in as you're coming into the class. I do try to use humor. I'll show you a cartoon in a second that's relevant to the material we're talking about. I've even tried to tell a joke. The other day I was telling a joke in class, and the students didn't laugh when I told a punchline, but then I told a joke of how a right hemisphere damage patient responded, and they laughed to that. So I was like, this is not really working, but as long as, I guess, I'm evoking emotion, they'll remember how bad I am at jokes and hopefully remember, the information about the right hemisphere. So I try. I try to make things relevant to our students, like Dorothy mentioned, related to their own lives. I teach a physiological psychology class, no surprise, and I talk about sleep in the brain. So instead of just talking about the different sleep stages and how the EEG brain waves look at each stage, that can be really boring. I open the discussion up in class and I say, well, how many hours of sleep did everybody get last night, right? Then we determine that the whole class, and usually myself, are all sleep deprived. Then we talk about what happens in the brain during sleep deprivation, and the students can get on board with that. We also talk about new drugs that people have been abusing to try to counteract some of the effects of caffeine and things like that to help them get through their day. So students like that as well. I try to challenge some of their misconceptions. I teach a focal point seminar on pseudoscience. So we talk about ghosts and ESP and the Loch Ness Monster. The first day of class, I give them, of course I'm a psychologist, so I give them this Likert scale survey, having them rate how much they believe in each of these phenomena, so on a 1 to 7 scale. And then I give them the same survey at the end of the quarter and show them their results. And usually, I've never had a class that didn't show this pattern, is they tend to be much more skeptical. So I think, oh, my work is done, right? They're all skeptical of these things. Although they tell me that I've ruined all these fun phenomena, right? So you can't win. Unusual, interesting case studies like Clive Waring. I try to use unusual facts or fun debates. In my introductory psychology class, I have them debate the use of animals, and we talk about ethical issues in that. So you can imagine students come back to me years from taking intro psych, and they still remember that debate. Here's a cartoon I like to show. We talk about memory. I think we may have found the cause of your sudden memory loss, and the little spike from Mr. Potato Head's hat is sticking in his brain. Okay, thank you guys for laughing. I also try to link it to movies they may have seen. So if we're talking about memory, I talk about Bourne Identity. I love that, right? Jason Bourne doesn't remember his name or where he lives, but he does remember his cool spy skills, right? Memento, it reminds me a lot of a Clive Waring video, right? Instead of having a journal, his character actually makes tattoos on his body to try to remember information. When I was a graduate student, this first came out, and we all went to go see it, and then we went to the coffee shop to talk all about it. We were big dorks about that. In this movie, you have to love, right? Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. She has a fight with her boyfriend, and then she hires a company to erase memory of that relationship. Okay, so that's kind of interesting too. Other neuroscience research. Oh yes, absolutely.
There was an article in one of the papers recently. They are able to erase memory now, according to, they shot people's brains and that memory disappears.
Well, you'll have to send me that, because I have read research where they try to limit the emotional component of a memory. So not actually, I don't know if this is the same thing that you're talking about, where they actually, so people have had a traumatic event. There was a case of somebody in New York on their subway system, a train conductor who had actually saw somebody commit suicide. And she was so traumatized she couldn't form relationships, keep her job. So there are beta blockers that they can administer that actually decreases not the memory, but the emotional content. They use it a lot with post-traumatic stress disorders. Is that similar to what you're talking about?
They use electronic probes to actually give an impulse. It's like, erase that circuit in the brain. And it was a recent article, it was a month or so ago.
Okay, great. I'll look for it, or if you could send it to me, that'd be great.
It was, a very interesting article.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. So the next area of research suggests that students have both explicit memory and more implicit memory. So explicit memory just refers to certain facts. So who's the president, the date, and implicit memory are memories for certain learned skills. We show that individuals who have damage or lesions in the medial temporal lobe can't remember facts, but can still remember certain skills. And you might be familiar with a classic case of HM. He was an individual like this. He couldn't remember certain facts, but he could remember how to drive a car, he could remember to ride his bike, and those kinds of things. So how can we apply this to our online classes? I try to use both recall tasks, where you're asking them to quizzes, and then I try to ask them more procedural tasks so they can apply the knowledge. So problem solving, those kinds of things, putting them in context. I also try to ask students to complete experiential learning outside of the classroom and then write about their activities online. That's a really nice, I think, use of discussion boards. Sometimes I'm not so much of a fan of a lot of the online discussion boards, but I like it for this because I think learning can take place and I think there's a lot of connections that the students can develop with one another. Online games you can do. I know that some of the textbooks already have crossword puzzles where you can integrate certain information easily online and students can practice. And then trying to apply the concepts that students have learned in many different settings, right? So not just in the context that you've described them in. In my classes, I use lots of examples, and I tell my students, for me, it's easier to remember example than a definition. And if they remember an example of, let's say, Clive Waring as a case study, then they can say, okay, well, what memory deficits did he have, and what area of the brain is most likely damaged, rather than knowing what anterograde amnesia is. You kind of work from the example backwards. Does that make sense? And I think for challenging concepts, that can be really helpful for students, and that's what I try to do in my classes, because that's how I learn information. Yes?
Is there a spectrum of, when we think about our students in our classroom, is there any idea of how many students, is there a spectrum, first of all, explicit and implicit? Do some people just have better explicit and poorer implicit? Is that spectrum real, or is there an estimate of how many people fall on either?
I have not heard of that. Have you heard of that, Dorothy? I think that some information lends itself more to explicit versus implicit memory. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in my physiological psychology class, it's a lot of rote explicit memory, right? They have to know this fact. It's like medical school. But I try to think of ways in which it could be more implicit. Does that make sense? But I don't know. I've never heard of
people being divided up based on explicit versus implicit.
Yeah.
And implicit memory too, you can think of it as learning how to ride a bike, learning how to play an instrument, you learning how to throw a ball. Mm-hmm. These are sort of skills that you learn.
Just imagine that some people can memorize an entire list of phone numbers but they're not so great at picking up how to play tennis.
I see what you're saying. There is a debate in the memory literature with regard to how good you can be with practice. Mm-hmm. So with the explicit memory, there's an interesting, he was a grad student, now he's a psychology professor, who remembered the first 40,000 digits of pi. His name is Rajan, and I love to show Rajan in my class. He's fabulous, and he'll recite it, at lightning speed, and anywhere he'll say, you could ask him, what's the 50,107 digit of pi, and he'll say 6 or whatever it is. I don't know the answer to it. But he worked with a group of researchers who claims that anybody could do that. Okay. That if we all took enough time and energy and commitment and wanted to learn pi, we could do that. Then there are other people who say, no, some people just don't have that propensity for numbers and aren't going to be as skilled as that. So it's a debated topic. Good question. Thanks. One way I try to do some of this explicit, implicit memory in my class is I use the eye clickers. Does anybody use eye clickers or have used eye clickers? Nobody? You have? Yeah. And did you like them? Not so much?
Yeah, if they're working, and it takes a half hour from everybody to test them, make sure.
So if they work, do you like them?
Yeah, absolutely, it's fun. I think the students actually like that process of checking to make sure they're working. It's it's a shared experience.
Anybody else use eye clickers before? So if you haven't, just to give you a little background, they're basically a remote control device with A through E as options. The new ones now, you can actually type things in, but I don't even get that fancy. I just use A through E. And what you can do is you can ask the students a question. You can ask it verbally. I'm overly prepared, so I always have a PowerPoint, A through E, and then I ask the class a question. They all get out their clickers, they respond, and the reason I like iClickers is for two reasons. One, their answers are anonymous. You can record, if you're giving points or assigning credit, you can see how individual students responded, but usually I just make sure they're responding. Then you get a nice little graph of how the entire class responded. So one reason it's anonymous. So it's not like I'm calling on you, and if you give the incorrect answer, everyone's going to know you responded incorrectly. They won't know. It's just this bar chart. The second reason I really like it is the students are getting immediate feedback. So when you're asking them a question, they make their response, they see right away, oh, I didn't get that, everyone else did. I better go back and study that. And one of my favorite ways to use iClickers is if you know there's a challenging concept in your class. I mentioned I teach introductory psychology, and two of the terms they always get confused are independent and dependent variables. And that will haunt them forever in psychology, right? So it's the one thing I want them to know out of everything when they leave my introductory psychology class. But they always get confused. So I have a clicker question, and I'd say usually 40 to 50% of the students answer that question correct, and I get so excited, right? Because we have all these wrong answers. Then I go into further explanation. We really spend some time talking about it. Then I ask a different clicker question about independent and dependent variables, and 98 or 99% of the students get it right. How could that be better, right? You see instantaneously that your students are learning it. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, do you then check toward the end of the course to see if they still remember it? What's your sense of getting to remember?
That's a good question.
I'm just kind of curious because we all have something like that, right? If they knew one thing, I'm like, oh,
right.
This would be it. And then do I ever remember it? No. You know?
Right. They know it then, right?
Yeah, right. You know, when we were in the room, it was a beautiful experience for me as the instructor, right?
That's a good point. All I hear about is anecdotally from the professors that have them next that some students don't remember. But I don't know if they're my
This is one of the things I'm interested in because one of the things I deal with, I do this kind of thing at UIC, and one of the things we see is, one of the things I don't even know how to deal with it in the current structure, retention from one course to another, right? Did you learn enough in this course to go and then pass the next course? Do we have our prerequisites right, and are we teaching correctly across those?
Yeah.
That's why I was curious, because I agree. If you don't know independent variables, you're now hosed.
Right, yeah, but you're exactly right. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. An interesting, when iClickers first started, I love technology, so I was one of the first adopters, and it was really fun to try it out. And I had a graduate student from communications run a little study in my class, and it was all her idea. I can't take any credit for it. And the one interesting thing she discovered with iClickers was that when students use the clicker to respond in class, they were less likely to raise their hand because they felt, I participated, I'm done. I don't need to answer your questions. I've answered. Which is not what I would have thought at all. Intuitively, I would have thought, oh, they're getting involved, they want to answer questions. So that was an unintended side effect. Again, it was just one classroom, so we need to do repeated study to make sure it's reliable, but that could be an issue too. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Yes?
The iClicker gives, I think, a democratic feeling in the class. I usually use it for polls and voting and things like that, and it could be about the class or it could be about a topic or ethical issue, and I think that helps empower students and makes them, it definitely, as you're saying, makes it interactive.
Yeah, I like that.
Immediate feedback.
Oh, yeah, I have so many videos, I can't decide which to show, so I've done that before, and I'm like, if you want to see the video on face recognition deficits, press A. If you want to see it on this, press B, and then I don't decide. So yeah, I always forget that you can use the clickers for that. Yeah.
I just wanted to add, if you all are interested in iClickers, but you don't want to invest in them or have your students invest in them, there are mobile options, so that there are free mobile applications that you can use and incorporate in your PowerPoints, where you're doing the same thing, polling the students and getting immediate feedback and displaying results and stuff like that. So there are a lot.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. There's one Poll Everywhere, which is a common one. And you can actually there's software that actually needs to be installed on the classroom computer. So just give you a heads up if you're going to use that. You have to put in a ticket to IT, and they'll install the Poll Everywhere software.
And they'll do it right away now. So.
Yeah, they're great. And then just be aware that students are using their cell phones in class. So if you don't like that, then you might want to do the clickers. But if you're okay with that, it's a free way to use that. Also, there are tubs you can check out
So if you want to have it for the entire quarter, you just have an activity you want to do, I'll be happy to contact you, or some people in the IT department can help you. You can check out a tub of iClippers just to use it to give it a try. One instance where that might be appropriate is I do review games with iClippers, which are really fun. So I started this strategy, so I have a PowerPoint where it starts off with easy questions, and then it gets progressively more difficult. And then what I tell students is everybody can answer the first question, and then only can you answer the next question if you've gotten that first question correct. And I'm always worried this is never going to work out because I only bring one prize, so it's like a $5 gift card from Starbucks, right? And usually there's always one winner at the end. Of course, I'd be happy if there was more than one, because that means the students are getting even the challenging questions, but it usually doesn't happen that way. But it's a really fun way to use iClippers without having them invested, because there are $32, I think they're going right now.
And just another fun technology you can use. Also, we know from research that animals who live in enriched environments, so if rats had wheels, if they had toys, if they live with other rats, showed more learning than rats who lived in impoverished environments. Furthermore, related to Dorothy's talk, they showed more neuronal growth in their hippocampus. So, how can we use this information to help our students learn? I try to use interactive videos in my class, so rather than just showing Clive wearing, I have them discuss it, or I'll stop at a certain point and have them answer a question. I try to maintain constant interaction with my students, and I think this is particularly important for online classes, because sometimes you don't know your students very well from their online persona. So I try to, we have an introduction discussion board where we talk about who we are, our career options, something fun we did over the break. I show a picture of my dog, whatever you can do to create a social connection with your students. I try to have students interact with new students. So if they're forming groups, I change those groups throughout the quarter. So it's not always the same group of students who are together. Also, changing the online environment and the task for students could be a useful strategy. So 1 week you might have them listen to a lecture. The second week you might have them discuss. Third week you might have them critique something, just to keep the environment enriched for the students. One way I try to do this is I use something called a media assignment. And I can't take credit for this. I was at a teaching conference and I heard this idea, and I wish I remember where it was because I would give the person credit. Hopefully one of these days it'll be like, it's my idea, and then I could put their name. So I stole this from somebody, but I love this assignment. So what the students do is they look for information in the popular press. So not a formal research article that's relevant to the class material. They find that material, and then I ask them to critically evaluate it. So I ask them to look about the claim that they're being asked to believe, try to see what evidence supports this claim, if the information in the media is consistent or not with the readings, and then asking them to provide specific examples to support their rationale. I also have them evaluate other students' media assignments. So you can imagine in the field of neuroscience, there's all sorts of fun things where you get these splashy headlines, and then when you read it and are more critical of it, you realize it isn't groundbreaking research. There's a lot of research that will say women are horrible at spatial navigation, neuroscience shows, right? And once you read it, no, actually not. It's these rats under this one specific condition with this specific type of maze. And so it's fun for the students to critique that. One added benefit that I usually see in my classes is that after students complete this media assignment, they're kind of primed to look for things relevant to the class. So it's fun, even when the assignment's done, I get emails or students coming up to me after class saying, oh, Dr. Virtual, I saw this thing in the news, and then we talk about that in class. So I like that as kind of a side effect of this assignment. Also, as Dorothy already mentioned, we know that neuroscience research shows that repetition of information helps the brain grow new dendrites through this trial and error process. We know the cerebellum's heavily involved in this. This is the structure right in the back of the brain that they often call a little brain. And it's also key in developing what we call metacognitive skills, which you might already be aware of, which is just assessing what we know about something. I'll give you a reading example. If students are reading a text or a passage of a text, at the end, they have to assess, well, do I understand this information? And if they do, then they can move on and keep reading. But I think more importantly, they need to say, well, I didn't understand this well. I need to go back and reread. And that's what we're referring to as this metacognitive process. So how do we help students with this? I try to use pre and post quizzes online so they can assess their learning and get practice. I try to give them all sorts of optional assignments, particularly before exams, small group online discussions, and then I have a similar outline throughout my online course so they always know where to find things. The DOTS training and the FITS group were great at that, so they always know where the quizzes are, they always know where the lecture is, they always know where the lecture notes, and they can repeat this week after week. Also, this issue came up already. We want to avoid embarrassing students, right? So that's a good use of the clickers because we know research shows that embarrassment can release cortisol and increase stress, which actually decreases learning of information. One way online I try to minimize this is I have a section called Netiquette, where I talk to the students about how they should be constructively critiquing other students online. I also try to model that for my students. I've never had an issue, fortunately. Maybe I got lucky with some great students, or the setup has just worked well, where there's never been any kind of instance of that. But I'm always on the alert, making sure, particularly for controversial topics, that everybody's very sensitive and respectful. Lastly, we need to keep in mind, and this has already come up as well, that our students' attention is limited. And this is particularly through processing in the frontal lobe. So what can we do about this? Well, we can try to put less constraints on our students' working memory capacity. And working memory capacity just refers to the ability of the student to store information and process information simultaneously. So I'll give you another reading example. If a student's reading a text, they not only need to process and read that current information, but they need to link it with information they previously read and link it with information from their background knowledge. And even further, sometimes students are making predictions about what will happen next. So that puts a lot of constraints on a student's working memory. And particularly if it's difficult, right? Maybe they're having difficulty even understanding what they're currently reading, let alone trying to relate it to what they previously read. So this is something we can try to help the students with. Dorothy already mentioned chunking. It's a really valuable tool. There's a lot of great cognitive research looking at 5 to 7 items are kind of the ideal pieces of information we want to limit it to students. So online, I try to limit that both visually and auditorily. I try to use lots of bullet points, listing key ideas. Even in my lectures, I have no shame and I say, here's some key ideas. And when I say that, the students all know, oh, I gotta write that down, because that's most likely gonna be on the exam. I have no problem pointing out to them, these are the key theories of cognitive processing you need to know. And I'm fine with that, as long as they learn the information. Keeping my online lectures short, this is really hard for me because when I first taught my first online class, I thought, oh, I can just record my regular face-to-face lecture and put it online. And DOTS and the FITS group says, no, you cannot do that. Students' attention is so limited. In fact, research shows that they tend, about 12 minutes is kind of the max that students will watch an online lecture. And they showed recently in one of the graduate schools, they posted these training videos for grad students, and the video was 25 minutes, and they can look at the data now with D2L, and they showed about 12, 15 minutes the students stopped watching. So if we know that, why would we put ourselves in that situation to create a long lecture? But that really makes me kind of think, well, what's the key things I want the students to know? I can't tell them everything that I do in class. I really have to focus in on 5 to 7 pieces of information. So I always try to keep that in mind. I try to connect new information with previous information. You guys mentioned that as a good strategy too. So even throughout the course, I say, oh, remember Clive? This is similar to that. So all the concepts try to come back into place. Link it with their background knowledge, and then I try my best to give them timely feedback on quizzes, assignments, and projects so they know where they stand with things. So this is just kind of a summary of what I try to do based on neuroscience research, fostering visualization, trying to evoke emotion, trying to test both students' explicit and implicit memory pathways, trying to give them rich learning environments, repeated practice, and then trying to limit their attentional resources as best as I can. So any questions, thoughts that you have? I know I'm a quick talker. Yes?
I see so many connections between Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and what you've done over here. It's just great.
I love Kahneman's stuff. It's terrific.
It's great, one of the best books.
other questions, thoughts? Yes.
What are neuron mirrors?
Oh, mirror neurons.
Mirror neurons.
Yes. We were just talking about this before the session. Are people familiar with mirror neuron research at all? This is really interesting. So mirror neurons are single cells, and they started this with monkey research that are active when the monkey is doing something and seeing something. So that's where the mirror comes in. That the neurons mirror the event that they saw. And let me give you just a little history on how this started. It was actually, like a lot of neuroscience research, I think Dorothy would probably agree, it just stumbled upon by accident, right? Someone was looking for mirror neurons. They were actually studying motor movement in a monkey's motor cortex and its frontal lobe. And what they found was that when the monkey reached for the item, this neuron was active, which is what they expected, right? They're like, oh great, this is reflective of motor movement. But then when that researcher reached for the object, that same neuron was active. And they thought it was like some malfunction with their design, with their equipment, something's wrong, right? This should be involved with motor movement. Why would it be also involved when they see someone else do it? So initially you might think, so what? Who cares, right? Who cares if this neuron is active when the animal does something as when they see somebody else do something? Well, it has huge potential implications for all sorts of human behavior, right? Imitation in child development, right? How do we learn things before the child begins to speak? They watch their mother, father, or their caregiver tie their shoes, right? They listen to certain phrases so that they can actually mimic them, right? So a lot of people say that it helps with empathy. There's been new research linking potentially difficulties with mirror neuron functioning and autism or Asperger's, right? Because they have different difficulty processing emotion. So maybe their mirror neurons are not working in the same way that other people's and they can't empathize. So they've done EEG studies with kids who suffer from Asperger's to see. They give them these simple tasks where they have them move their hand like this, and then they watch images of someone else moving their hand, and they say, and again, it's not a single neuron in humans. We don't do single cell research, fortunately, in humans. So it's EEG, so we're looking at billions of neurons. But in the same inferior frontal region, we don't see that same area as in people who don't suffer from Asperger's. Did I go into way too much detail? No.
Now, is it true that the mirror neurons themselves have not been isolated? It's more a phenomena that's being observed, or?
So
do they exist? Are they an actual thing, or?
Yeah, they've observed them.
In animals.
Right. Okay. Because the research I've read was that the phenomena has been witnessed, but
in humans.
Okay.
Correct.
But not.
But you're right. So we're not going to cut, unfortunately, human skull open and look at one single cell, but we can do that with animals. Mm-hmm. So in animals, we're able to say that single cell is active during both of those tasks. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? That's up for debate.
But is it only a mirror neuron, or is it also it's also functioning in other ways?
We don't. That's an excellent question.
So we don't know that literally there are separate neurons that are mirror neurons.
Correct.
And others that are.
Correct. So. People tie evolutionary reasons for why we might have neurons wired in this way, and that makes sense. But then there are other people saying that the research is limited. And do you have anything to add, Dorothy?
Just that those neurons are physical entities. They're the same things that I just showed you up there. They're physical neurons, and they populate in specific areas of brain, mainly in motor. Right now, people are saying they're finding them elsewhere, but they only live in motor types of regions. So regions where there's a physical action that is being observed. It's not, in other brain regions where you're mirroring something else. The mirroring is an actual physical motor movement.
Right. But what we don't know is, does that neuron have other functionality, or is it that's their only role?
In animals, that neuron can also make you move. Mm-hmm. So it's in regions of the brain that's responsible for creating the signal that actually will make you reach out and grab it.
But also has a mirror.
Yeah, but it has the mirror capability.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In animals.
It's exciting research.
I have a question. I'm not sure who can answer that. Is there any possibility that the neuron will retreat? Like when we talk about we'll forget something, or is it just a part of the section of the brain have certain issue? I'm just talking about the cell itself. Is there any possibility in terms of the plastic itself? Would that be retreat? Like would that be back to certain kind of original stage?
not
Yes,
contiguous.
yeah, there is, so cells can grow and then prune back. It's a use it or lose it phenomenon.
Right.
If certain pathways are being used and then you stop using them, it's just like a muscle, right? You work out, it gets bigger, you stop working out, it's flabby again. You know, so it's a similar concept with neurons. So structurally, they can grow and then they can retract, yes.
And would that be the same phenomena as under stress falling back into an old habit, or your thinking becoming less complex under stress?
Neurologically, I don't know. Just as a metaphor for it, yes.
Right. So okay.
Yeah, but neurologically, I'm
not sure
couldn't
what
tell
it
you.
would-
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the inverse classroom style of teaching?
The flip learning?
Well,
is that similar to what?
Well, inverted style, because I use this in some of the math courses I teach. The student is responsible for looking at the presentation, reading the chapter before class, and then in class we use it for problem solving and answering questions.
I love that approach. When I teach a hybrid section of my courses, that's exactly what I do. Is online, I post all my lectures, all the content. It's very content heavy online, and then the discussion and activities are all in class. And I think it's kind of changed the way I teach regularly in my face-to-face classes, where I think they can read the information on their own and learn it all on their own. They're all smart students. But what can I add to it? So yeah, I love that idea. I think that's great.
The only thing I would add to that is that, and this ties into the point you were making about the students get they don't respond as much in class as what is phrased, because if they're responsible for being able to help them solve the problem in class, it's like putting them on the spot.
Yeah, that's true. So you do have to be careful. But I think there are ways you can get around that, right? So if you have them work in small groups before they have to present, then I think they can kind of check their results with the other students and walk through it and kind of practice. So I think that can help with some of those anxiety issues for sure.
So you talked about a little bit about online class, and I actually went to a workshop for online teaching a couple months ago.
Oh, great!
And it was actually taught by people. It was an engineering class, I think undergraduate.
Okay.
It was really interesting. I heard a lot of similar things as what they're saying.
Oh,
they
nice.
honed their lecture to about 15 minutes, and the professor said it was really interesting because he really had to get rid of everything else. And for each lecture, what is the most critical things? He said it made a lot better teacher in general for all of the other classes. The other interesting thing was just that there was a lot of international people signed up for the class, so you had to be so careful how you word things. And they said even with math, they were finding people from different countries who were interpreting the questions differently.
Oh, I'm sure.
So it was really interesting.
That's a good point. I'm glad my information was consistent. That's good to hear. Thank you. One of the other things I want to mention about the international students with online, you can provide a transcript. So I have a transcript of my lectures so that students can go look up in the dictionary or ask me, what does this term mean? And they'll see the spelling, particularly for physiological psychology. There's a lot of strange terminologies that, Wernicke's area starts with a W. Who would know, right? So I think to have the transcript is nice. And then I think people forget that I leave the lectures up the whole quarter. So if a student says, wait a minute, what was she talking about day one? They can go back and watch that one time if they have to, or 100 times. And I think for second language learners, that can be really helpful. There's been some resistance to people teaching online, particularly for, I don't want to say remedial courses, but very low-level courses. And from my perspective, I think that could be the most useful and promising because they can watch the lectures again and again. They can stop it and watch a section again or ask a question about something. We have anonymous discussion boards where they can post an anonymous question they don't get at the opportunity in class. I feel, and I don't know if this is the same for other online instructors, but I feel responsible. I try to address each student in my online class. I have 40 students, but I try to address each one of them because I feel like I'm not in class. I want to have that connection. I want to make sure they're on the same page. So I think there are a lot of advantages to the online forum.
We saw this. We did something similar with the chemistry class at UNC. We saw very similar behavior. You get peaks around tests, and then toward finals, the usage of the videos just soared, and it was clearly reviewed.
Yep, absolutely.
And
that's
like
great.
A good thing,
Yeah, in my hybrid class where I meet one day a week online and have one day in class,
they say, why can't you have your in-class lectures online? I'm like, you don't want to see me at all. Because of that. They want to review. I'm a quick talker, right? They can't keep up and they want to review things. So I get that. That makes sense. And I'm glad you mentioned chemistry. We're starting to get chemistry faculty at DePaul to teach online courses. And some of the things that are useful that I hadn't thought about is in the lab, you may every quarter explain, I don't know a lot about chemistry, what the beaker is and where you put certain things and what it all looks like. Well, you can record that. Let students watch that, so when they come in, they already have this idea of what it's going to look like. That saves you time. And then for students who are nervous about working in the lab, they can go back and be like, wait, what was that? I can go back online.
It's like a mini flip, right?
Exactly.
You prep them for the class so you get more time, more benefit out of the time in class.
And I love that. I think that's a great use. It doesn't have to be an online class. It could just be that component.
Well, thank you so much to Stevie and Dorothy for